In the late 19th century, London stood as the beating heart of the British Empire, a city of immense wealth, booming industry, and global influence. But behind its grand architecture and polished streets, there lay another London, one hidden in filth, fog, and despair. This was the East End, a district synonymous with poverty, overcrowding, and hopelessness. And within its darkest alleys, the legend of Jack the Ripper would be born. Whitechapel, in 1888, was a place most of the city's elites never dared to enter. It was a world apart from the glamour of West End theaters or the wealth of Mayfair mansions. Here, life was brutal, cheap, and short. Tens of thousands of immigrants, laborers, and destitute families crowded into crumbling tenements and lodging houses. Alcoholism was rampant, jobs were scarce, and violence was a daily reality. The stench of open sewers mixed with the choking smog of factories. Rats-infested homes, and disease spread quickly through the narrow, damp streets. It was here, in this desperate setting, that the women who would become Jack the Ripper's victims tried to survive. The lives of women in Whitechapel were among the hardest of all. Many were widows or abandoned by their husbands. With little opportunity for stable work, some turned to casual prostitution, offering their services for a few pennies to buy food or a bed for the night. These women were not criminals by choice. They were casualties of poverty, forced to risk their safety for survival. And in 1888, they would become targets of a killer whose brutality shocked not only London, but the entire world. To understand the terror that followed, one must first imagine the streets of Whitechapel at night. Gas lamps flickered dimly through a heavy blanket of fog, casting shadows that twisted and shifted in the dark. Narrow passageways wound through a maze of buildings, many with hidden courtyards or dead ends. Lodging houses overflowed with the homeless, while taverns spilled out drunk men and women who staggered through the alleys. It was a place where anonymity was easy, where strangers disappeared into the mist, and where a murderer could vanish without a trace. Law enforcement in the East End was stretched thin. The Metropolitan Police were distrusted by locals, who often saw them as outsiders uninterested in their struggles. Crime was frequent: robberies, stabbings, drunken brawls. But nothing prepared Whitechapel for what was about to unfold in the autumn of 1888. That year would be remembered forever as the Autumn of Terror, the season when a nameless killer hunted women through the streets and carved his place into history. Before the murders began, there were already whispers of violence. London newspapers reported attacks on women, mysterious killings, and rumors of maniacs roaming the slums. But these stories rarely reach beyond the East End. The wealthy half of the city preferred to look away from Whitechapel's misery. It was easier to ignore than to acknowledge the suffering just a few miles from their homes. Yet soon, Jack the Ripper would make sure the whole world paid attention. What made the crime so shocking was not simply that women were murdered. After all, violence in Whitechapel was nothing new. It was the savagery of the acts. The killer didn't just end lives. He mutilated bodies with a precision that suggested both hatred and skill. Each attack seemed to grow bolder, each victim more brutally destroyed than the last. For the first time, Londoners were faced with something chillingly modern: the idea of a serial killer, a predator who killed not for money or revenge, but for the sheer compulsion to destroy. The East End, already plagued by despair, now descended into fear. Women walked in groups or avoided the streets altogether at night. Men spoke in whispers of a shadowy figure lurking in the fog. The police increased patrols, but the killer always seemed one step ahead, striking suddenly and vanishing into the darkness. and the newspapers, hungry for sales, gave him a name that would live forever, Jack the Ripper. But who was he? Even in the beginning, speculation ran wild. Some claimed he was a foreigner, blending into the immigrant population. Others whispered that he might be a butcher or a doctor, given the surgical nature of the mutilations. There were even theories that he was a wealthy gentleman, hunting the poor for sport, slipping back into the safety of high society after each crime. The uncertainty only deepened the fear. In Whitechapel, every stranger could be the Ripper. Every shadow might hide a killer. As we begin this story, we step into a world on edge. London, the proud capital of empire, suddenly faced a threat it could not understand, let alone control. A predator had emerged from the darkness, striking at the most vulnerable and taunting the authorities who hunted him. His true name was never known, his face never revealed, but his legacy of terror has endured for more than a century. This is the story of Jack the Ripper, the unknown killer whose crimes turned Whitechapel into a hunting ground, whose brutality shocked the Victorian world, and whose identity remains the greatest mystery in the history of crime. The shadows of Whitechapel had always hidden poverty, vice, and despair. But after 1888, they would forever carry something darker, an echo of footsteps in the fog, a glint of steel in the night, and the chilling reminder that evil can wear no face at all. And so our journey begins. The night was Thursday, August 30th, 1888. The summer in London was nearing its end, but in Whitechapel, the heat of misery lingered. That night, Nichols, known simply as Polly, walked the dimly lit streets. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5, and like many women of the East End, she had been abandoned by her husband and left to survive however she could. Poverty had driven her into the world of casual prostitution. For a few pennies, enough to buy food or a bed for the night, Polly offered herself on the corners of Whitechapel Road. But on this night, she carried nothing. Her last few coins had been spent on gin. She had no bed money, and without earning a few pence, she faced sleeping rough in the streets. Witnesses recalled seeing her outside a lodging house around midnight, telling the keeper that she would quickly earn her das money and return. Those were her last known words to the living world. In the early hours of August 31st, 1888, a carman named Charles Cross set out for work along Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel. The fog hung heavy that morning, and silence wrapped the street in an eerie calm. At about 3:40 a.m., Cross stumbled upon what he thought was a bundle of rags lying near a stable yard. But as he approached, the shape revealed itself to be a woman. Her skirt had been pulled down modestly, as though someone had tried to cover her after death. Cross believed she was merely drunk, passed out in the street, but as another carman joined him, the horror became clear. Nichols was dead. When the police arrived, they discovered the true brutality of her fate. Polly's throat had been slashed twice, so deeply that her windpipe was nearly severed. Her lower abdomen had been viciously mutilated, with long cuts running across her stomach. The violence was beyond anything the local constables had seen before. This was not a simple killing. It was something darker, calculated, savage, and terrifying. At first, the authorities hesitated to link Polly's death to a serial murderer. After all, crime in Whitechapel was common, and drunken fights often ended in bloodshed. But the ferocity of the wounds told a different story. This was no random attack. This was the work of someone who killed with intent, someone who wanted to shock, mutilate, and destroy. News of the murder spread quickly. By morning, whispers of a monster stalking Whitechapel reached every lodging house and tavern. Women shivered with fear, while men muttered about a maniac roaming the streets. The press seized upon the story, printing lurid details and fueling a growing sense of dread. London had seen murders before, but nothing quite like this. The post-mortem examination carried out by Dr. Llewellyn deepened the mystery. He determined that the killer used a sharp knife, likely 6 to 8 inches long, and that the cuts were made with surprising speed and precision. The wounds to the abdomen suggested a disturbing knowledge of human anatomy, perhaps the work of a butcher, a doctor, or someone familiar with cutting flesh. Yet the brutality was uncontrolled, as if driven by frenzy. The doctor could not be certain, but the possibility that this was the beginning of something new, something monstrous, could not be ignored. Mary Ann Nichols was buried quietly, mourned by few. In Whitechapel, death was a constant companion, and the poor often passed with little ceremony. Yet her murder marked the opening of a chapter that would haunt the city forever. She was the first of the canonical 5, the 5 women whose deaths would forever be linked to the name Jack the Ripper. For the residents of Whitechapel, Polly's death became a grim warning. Women began to walk with more caution, seeking safety in numbers. Lodging housekeepers advised their tenants not to wander alone. But poverty left little choice. The women who worked the streets could not simply stop. Hunger and homelessness were stronger than fear, and so the shadow of death lingered over them as they continued their nightly search for survival. The police, under Inspector Frederick Aberline, began their investigation. They questioned witnesses, retraced Polly's last steps, and examined the crime scene. But there was little evidence. No weapon was found. No reliable eyewitness could describe a suspect. The killer had struck silently, efficiently, and vanished into the fog without a trace. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols was not just another crime. It was the spark that lit the fire of the Autumn of Terror. The city did not yet know it, but this was only the beginning. In the weeks to come, more women would fall, each death more gruesome than the last, and London would be plunged into fear unlike anything it had ever known. Jack the Ripper had made his first mark. The streets of Whitechapel would never be the same again. Just over a week had passed since the brutal murder of Mary Ann Nichols, and Whitechapel was still reeling from the shock. Yet the fear had not fully set in. Some residents dismissed Polly's death as the result of a drunken quarrel or a lone madman who had already vanished into the night. Life in the East End had always been hard, and the people had grown used to tragedy. But on the morning of September 8th, 1888, London awoke to a new horror, one that erased any doubt that a predator was at work in the shadows. The victim was Annie Chapman. She was 47 years old, small and frail, with thinning dark hair and weary eyes. Like Mary Ann Nichols before her, Annie was a woman battered by life. Born into a respectable family, she had once lived a stable life, married to a coachman named John Chapman. But hardship followed her. Alcoholism crept into her life, her marriage fell apart, and her children either died young or were taken from her. Homeless, impoverished, and sickly, she was plagued by tuberculosis. Annie drifted into the East End, living hand to mouth, selling flowers, crochet work, and when necessary, her body. On the evening of September 7th, Annie was seen in a lodging house on Dorset Street. She had no money for a bed that night. She told the deputy keeper she would soon earn it, stepping back into the night with determination in her eyes. Those were the last words she was known to have spoken. Just before dawn, in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Annie Chapman's life ended in an act of unimaginable brutality. At around 6 a.m., a resident of the house, John Davis, walked into the yard. What he saw would haunt him forever. Annie's body lay crumpled on the cold ground, her throat slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed. Her clothing had been pulled up, exposing her, and her abdomen was laid open in a savage display of mutilation. Her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her shoulder. And, chillingly, some of her internal organs had been taken, surgically removed with precision. The sheer savagery of the crime sent shockwaves through Whitechapel. Unlike Polly Nichols, whose mutilations were discovered in the dark of early morning, Annie's body was found in daylight, in a crowded street where dozens of families lived. The killer had taken incredible risks, working in near silence while residents slept just feet away. That he escaped unseen seemed almost impossible, and yet he had vanished once again, leaving behind only terror and mystery. The post-mortem examination deepened the horror. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who conducted the autopsy, concluded that the killer possessed anatomical knowledge. The removal of organs was not clumsy or random. It had been done with care, as if by someone who understood where to cut. Some suggested he might have been a doctor, a medical student, or perhaps a butcher accustomed to slaughter. Others whispered about a collector of body parts, feeding into grotesque rumors of black markets and dark rituals. The press seized on every grisly detail. Newspapers described the scene in lurid language, ensuring that the story spread far beyond Whitechapel. For the first time, the name Jack the Ripper began to circulate. The idea of a single killer, someone who killed for pleasure, not profit, captured the imagination of the public. London was terrified, but also fascinated. Ordinary murders faded from the headlines. The Ripper had become front-page news. Fear spread through the East End like wildfire. Women were warned not to go out alone, but hunger drove them into the streets anyway. Some carried sticks or sought the company of friends, hoping safety could be found in numbers. But in the fog and confusion of Whitechapel, safety was an illusion. The killer had proven that he could strike boldly, vanish quickly, and leave behind only mutilation and mystery. The police redoubled their efforts. Scotland Yard assigned more officers, and Inspector Aberline himself took a central role in the investigation. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewing residents and piecing together Annie's last movements. Witnesses claimed to have seen her with a man in the early hours, described variously as dark-haired, shabby, or foreign-looking. But the accounts were contradictory, and in the end, no solid lead emerged. Frustration grew within the force. The public demanded answers, but the killer was a phantom. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. It was as though he walked through walls, slipping between reality and nightmare. Aberline and his men pursued every rumor. Foreign sailors, mad doctors, local butchers. But the trail always ended in the fog. For the people of Whitechapel, Annie's murder shattered any illusions that Polly's death had been a solitary act of violence. This was something far more sinister. A pattern had emerged, and it pointed to a predator who would not stop. Mothers warned their daughters. Lodging houses buzzed with fear. And the newspapers, hungry for sensation, fed the fire with lurid headlines. Ghastly murder in Whitechapel. Another woman mutilated. In the weeks that followed, Annie Chapman's name became part of a grim tally, her death a symbol of the vulnerability of poor women in London. She was no longer simply Annie, a woman who had once lived a quiet family life, who had known love, loss, and hardship. She became part of a legend, one of the Canonical Five, remembered forever as a victim of the world's most infamous killer. The blood in the streets of Hanbury Street did not wash away easily. It stained the memory of London, deepened the terror of the East End, and cemented Jack the Ripper as something more than a criminal. He was a phantom, a monster cloaked in fog, striking with inhuman savagery. And as the people mourned Annie Chapman, a dreadful realization spread through the city. Jack the Ripper was only beginning. The autumn of terror was far from over. The streets of Whitechapel would soon run red again. The terror in Whitechapel deepened with each killing. By late September 1888, 2 women, Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, had been butchered with a savagery that seemed unimaginable. Scotland Yard was under intense pressure, the press was relentless, and the people of London lived in fear of a faceless killer. Rumors swirled, theories multiplied, and yet the Ripper remained a phantom. And then came the night of September 30th, a night that would forever be remembered as the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. She was 44 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had settled in London years earlier, known as Long Liz. She lived a life of hardship, drifting between cleaning work, sewing, and occasional prostitution. Stride was different from the previous victims. She was slightly better dressed, somewhat healthier, and not known for heavy drinking. That night, she had been seen with several men near Berner Street, where she often sought clients. Witnesses later recalled her in the company of a dark-haired man, neatly dressed, who seemed protective of her. But in the fog of memory, details blurred. At about 1 a.m., in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street, Elizabeth Stride was attacked. Her body was discovered by Louis Diemschutz, a local club steward, when his horse-drawn cart nearly ran over her. At first, he thought he had struck a bundle of rags, but as he leaned closer, the terrible truth became clear. Elizabeth lay on the ground, her throat slashed deeply from left to right. Blood pooled beneath her, but unlike the earlier victims, her body showed no signs of mutilation. Her clothes remained intact, her abdomen untouched. This difference puzzled investigators then, and it continues to puzzle historians today. Had the Ripper been interrupted? Many believe so. Diemschutz's arrival with his cart may have startled the killer, forcing him to flee before completing his ritual of mutilation. Others argue Elizabeth may not have been a Ripper victim at all, but rather the casualty of a violent client or a gang-related attack. Yet the timing and the method of her throat wound strongly suggest that Jack the Ripper struck here and fled before he could finish. But the Ripper was not done. Less than an hour later, just after 1:30 a.m., another murder occurred barely a mile away in Meter Square. The victim was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman who had lived a hard life of poverty and alcoholism. Earlier that night, she had been arrested for drunkenness near Aldgate. She was released from the station around 1 a.m., sober enough to walk, but still unsteady. Tragically, she wandered straight into the path of the Ripper. At 1:44 a.m., a police constable discovered her body in Mitre Square. The scene was horrific beyond description. Catherine's throat had been slashed open, her abdomen ripped apart, and her intestines pulled out and placed over her shoulder. Her face had been mutilated with savage precision. Her nose partially cut off, her eyelids slashed, her cheeks carved with deep cuts, and most chilling of all, her left kidney and part of her uterus had been removed, taken by the killer as a grisly trophy. The brutality of the attack stunned investigators. Unlike Elizabeth Stride, here the Ripper had more time, more privacy, and he used it to indulge his full compulsion for destruction. The mutilations were far worse than anything seen before, showing a disturbing escalation in his crimes. By dawn, London was in shock. 2 women murdered within an hour of each other. One spared mutilation, perhaps by sheer luck. The other reduced to a spectacle of unimaginable cruelty. Panic spread like wildfire. If the Ripper could kill twice in one night, who could say how many more would die? The police were desperate. They scoured the streets, interviewing witnesses, following leads, and increasing patrols. For once, they had something tangible. Near Mitre Square, in Golston Street, a blood-stained piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found. It appeared the killer had used it to wipe his knife or his hands. Above it, scrawled in chalk on a wall, was a messaging. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The words sparked immediate controversy. Anti-Semitic tensions in Whitechapel were already high, and many feared the message would incite violence against the Jewish community. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the chalk writing erased before it could be photographed or studied, a decision that remains debated to this day. Was it the killer's taunt or a mere coincidence? We may never know. The double event cemented Jack the Ripper's place in history. For the first time, the entire city of London felt under siege. The newspapers published sensational headlines, printing every gruesome detail and speculating wildly about the killer's identity. Letters began arriving at police stations and newspaper offices, supposedly written by the murderer himself. One such letter, signed Jack the Ripper, gave the killer his eternal name. For the people of Whitechapel, the fear was suffocating. Women refused to walk alone, even in daylight. Lodging houses buzzed with rumors. Some claimed to have seen the killer, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, a foreign sailor, a butcher with blood on his apron. But the descriptions were vague, inconsistent, and unreliable. The truth was simple. The Ripper remained invisible, melting into the crowd, emerging only to strike with terrifying speed. The double event also exposed the limits of the police. Despite their efforts, despite increased patrols, the killer struck twice in one night. He moved through their net as if it didn't exist. Frustration within Scotland Yard grew. Detectives quarreled over theories. Some believed the Ripper was a mad surgeon, others a local laborer. Some thought he lived in Whitechapel itself, blending in with the very people he hunted. But all they truly knew was that he was still out there. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes became the third and fourth victims in what was now clearly a serial nightmare. Their deaths marked the height of the Autumn of Terror, the moment when London fully realized it was dealing with a predator unlike any it had ever seen. The Ripper had struck twice in one night, slipping away into the fog without leaving more than a scrap of cloth and a haunting message on a wall. His confidence had grown. His savagery escalated. The people of London waited in dread for his next move, knowing it was only a matter of time before he killed again. And when he did, the city would face the most horrifying murder of them all. By November of 1888, Whitechapel was paralyzed with fear. The double event of September 30th had shown that Jack the Ripper could strike twice in a single night, killing 2 women within an hour, vanishing without a trace, and leaving an entire city trembling. Police patrols had increased. The newspapers churned out endless headlines, and vigilante groups roamed the streets in search of the killer. Yet the Ripper had disappeared into the fog, silent for over a month. Some dared to hope it was over, that the murders had ended, that the shadow had lifted. But on the morning of November 9th, London awoke to a crime scene so horrific, so grotesque, that it would forever be remembered as the darkest chapter in the Autumn of Terror. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly. She was just 25 years old, far younger than the other canonical victims, and unlike the rest, she had not lived her entire life in poverty. Mary was of Irish descent, born somewhere in Limerick or perhaps Wales. Her origins remain uncertain. She was strikingly pretty, with auburn hair, and a youthful face that set her apart from the older, more weathered women who had fallen before her. Mary had lived in better circumstances once, claiming to have been married to a coal miner in Wales and later kept by a wealthy gentleman. But by 1888, her fortunes had collapsed. She lived in a small, single-room lodging at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, one of the most dangerous and impoverished corners of Whitechapel. On the night of November 8th, Mary was seen drinking in local pubs with friends and acquaintances. Witnesses later recalled her singing in her room late into the night, her sweet voice echoing through the walls of Miller's Court. She was heard singing the ballad, "A Violet from Mother's Grave." It was the last sound of life that anyone would remember from her room. At around 10:45 a.m. the next morning, Mary's landlord, Thomas Bowyer, approached her room to collect overdue rent. He knocked. There was no answer. He pushed aside the curtain that covered her small window and peered inside. What he saw was so shocking that he staggered back in horror. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay on the bed, mutilated beyond recognition. The crime scene was unlike anything the police or London had ever seen. Mary's throat had been slashed down to the spine. Her abdomen had been emptied, her organs scattered around the room. Her breasts had been cut off. Flesh had been stripped from her thighs. Parts of her body were placed on the bedside table, others beneath her head. Even her face had been carved away, reduced to an unrecognizable mask of horror. It was a scene of such total destruction that hardened investigators struggled to describe it. For the first time, Jack the Ripper had killed indoors, behind closed doors, with the privacy to take his time. No longer restricted by the risk of being discovered in a dark alley, he had hours to indulge his compulsion. The result was an explosion of violence, unlike anything in recorded criminal history at that time. The mutilations went far beyond what was necessary to kill. They were the work of someone driven by obsession, by frenzy, by a darkness so profound it defied understanding. The police who entered that room were traumatized. Inspector Aberline himself, the lead investigator, admitted that the scene was the most awful thing he had ever witnessed. Dr. Thomas Bond, who examined the remains, later wrote that the mutilations were the work of a man addicted to the homicidal and sexual mania. The brutality suggested not just murder, but a psychological need to obliterate, to desecrate, to annihilate the victim completely. Mary Jane Kelly's death shook London to its core. The newspapers described the murder in vivid detail, though even the most sensational headlines struggled to capture the horror of Miller's Court. Crowds gathered outside, weeping, whispering, and demanding justice. If there had been any doubt before, now it was gone. Jack the Ripper was not simply a murderer. He was a monster capable of cruelty beyond human comprehension. And yet, for all the horror of the crime, the killer once again escaped. Witnesses claimed to have seen Mary with a man the night before, a man described as fair-haired, about 30, with a blotchy face. Others said she was last seen with a dark-haired man carrying a parcel, but none of the descriptions matched, and none could be confirmed. The killer slipped through the cracks of time once more, leaving only blood and mystery behind. Mary Jane Kelly is often remembered as the final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. While there were later murders in Whitechapel that bore similarities, none carried the same definitive link. With her death, the autumn of terror reached its brutal climax. The Ripper had unleashed the full depth of his savagery, and then, like smoke in the wind, he disappeared. For the people of Whitechapel, Mary's murder was both the worst and the last. The fear lingered, but the killings ceased. Some believed the Ripper had died or been imprisoned for another crime. Others claimed he had fled London or that he had finally satisfied his bloodlust. Whatever the truth, the name Jack the Ripper was now carved into history, his legend sealed by the horror in Miller's Court. Mary Jane Kelly's life was short, tragic, and brutal at its end. Yet her death became the defining moment of the Ripper story. She was not just another victim. She was the symbol of ultimate terror, the proof of what the killer could do when freed from restraint. Her murder remains, to this day, one of the most gruesome and disturbing crimes ever recorded. The image of that small room in Miller's Court, with its single bed and blood-stained walls, became etched in the collective memory of London. And though more than a century has passed, the ghost of Mary Jane Kelly still lingers in the story of Jack the Ripper, a reminder of the night when the faceless killer reached the very height of his savagery and then vanished into the fog forever. In 1888, London was a city ruled not just by politicians and police, but by newspapers. The Victorian press had discovered the art of mass influence. Every morning, thousands of readers hungrily consumed the latest headlines, eager for scandal, crime, and sensation. And in the autumn of that year, nothing sold more papers than the murders of Jack the Ripper. From the very first killing, the press leapt upon the story with a ferocity equal to the killer himself. The gruesome deaths in Whitechapel were tailor-made for Victorian journalism. They had mystery, violence, poverty, and horror. But above all, they had a villain who was both invisible and unstoppable. Jack the Ripper was the perfect headline. Fear in human form, a shadow stalking the streets. And as the bodies piled up, so too did the columns of ink. Reporters swarmed Whitechapel. They interviewed residents, hovered near crime scenes, and filled their stories with lurid detail. Every cut, every mutilation, every whispered rumor found its way into print. And in their telling, the murders became more than crimes. They became theater. Londoners devoured the reports with both terror and fascination, reading by candlelight about the latest horror in the East End, safe in their middle-class homes while imagining the nightmare unfolding just a few miles away. The press did not merely report the murders, they shaped them. They gave the killer his name. Before the newspapers, he was simply an unknown murderer. But in late September, after the double murder of Stride and Eddowes, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. Written in red ink and addressed to Dear Boss, it mocked the police, boasted of the killings, and promised more. It was signed chillingly, Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The letter was published almost immediately, and just like that, the faceless killer had an identity. Jack the Ripper was born, not from police investigation, not from witness accounts, but from the words printed in the daily press. Whether the letter was truly written by the killer or by a journalist seeking to inflame the story remains a subject of endless debate. But its impact was undeniable. It transformed a series of murders into a legend. Soon, more letters followed. The most infamous came in October, the so-called From Hell letter delivered with a small box. Inside was a piece of human kidney, preserved in alcohol, claimed to have been taken from Catherine Eddowes. The letter was crude, written in a semi-literate style, taunting the authorities. Unlike the polished Dear Boss, note, this one carried an aura of genuine menace. Some believe it was real, a grotesque message from the killer himself. Others dismiss it as another hoax. But for the public, it only deepened the horror. The newspapers printed these letters, sometimes in full, ensuring that the killer's words reached tens of thousands of readers. Jack the Ripper was not just murdering women, he was speaking directly to the city, taunting it, haunting it. And the city responded with hysteria. Crowds gathered at every crime scene, gawking, speculating, whispering theories. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls spread wild stories about the killer's identity. Some claimed he was a foreign immigrant. Others swore he was a deranged doctor. Theories spread faster than the police could chase them. This hysteria was not limited to Whitechapel. Jack the Ripper became a household name across Britain and soon across the world. Newspapers in New York, Paris, and beyond carried the stories, feeding a global fascination. Never before had a murderer achieved such fame. He was the first truly modern serial killer. His identity not merely in the acts of violence, but in the narrative spun around him by the press. For the people of Whitechapel, however, the media frenzy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought attention to the appalling poverty and misery of the East End, conditions long ignored by the wealthier half of the city. On the other, it exploited the suffering of the poor, turning their tragedy into entertainment for distant readers. Residents of Whitechapel often felt hunted not only by the killer, but by reporters hungry for their stories. The press also fueled mistrust of the police. Each new murder was reported as another failure by Scotland Yard. Satirical cartoons mocked detectives as bumbling fools. Editorials accused the authorities of incompetence, corruption, or indifference. This constant barrage of criticism only increased the pressure on investigators like Inspector Aberline, who already faced an impossible task. The Ripper's legend grew with each headline, each mocking letter, each failure to catch him. By November, after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the hysteria reached its peak. The press coverage was relentless, describing the scene in Miller's Court with such ghastly detail that readers recoiled in horror, and then turned the page for more. Sales soared. For newspaper editors, Jack the Ripper was a grim blessing, a story that refused to die. For the people of London, he was a nightmare that no headline could contain. Looking back, it is clear that without the newspapers, Jack the Ripper might have remained a dark memory, a nameless killer haunting the slums. Instead, the press transformed him into a figure of myth, a name known across continents, a story told and retold for generations. The murders were real, the victims tragically human, but the legend was shaped in ink and paper, crafted by journalists who fed a city's hunger for fear. The panic, the hysteria, the image of a killer writing to taunt the world. This was not just a series of crimes. It was the birth of a cultural phenomenon. Jack the Ripper was no longer simply a murderer. He was a symbol of the unknown, the face of evil in an age of progress, a shadow that could not be caught. And as the newspaper screamed his name, the real man, whoever he was, slipped quietly into history unseen, unpunished, and immortalized by the very words printed to condemn him. By the autumn of 1888, London was a city in fear. The murders of Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly had plunged Whitechapel into terror. But beyond the narrow alleys and crowded lodging houses, the panic had spread to the highest levels of society. Parliament demanded answers. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, pressed Scotland Yard for results. And at the heart of this storm stood the detectives of the Metropolitan Police, men charged with catching a phantom who seemed always one step ahead. Inspector Frederick George Aberline was assigned to the case. A seasoned detective with years of experience in Whitechapel, Aberline was both respected and feared. Unlike many of his colleagues, he knew the East End intimately. He had walked its streets, spoken with its people, and understood the desperate rhythms of their lives. If anyone could untangle the mystery, it was him. But even for Aberline, the hunt for Jack the Ripper proved unlike anything he had ever faced. The investigation began with old-fashioned police work, canvassing the streets, interviewing witnesses, and gathering statements. Scores of constables patrolled Whitechapel at night, hoping to catch the killer in the act. Detectives combed lodging houses, questioned prostitutes, and scrutinized anyone who looked suspicious. Yet each murder seemed to happen under their very noses, as if the killer mocked their efforts. One of the greatest challenges was the lack of forensic science. In 1888, fingerprinting was not yet used, DNA analysis was a century away, and even crime scene preservation was primitive. Crowds often gathered around the bodies before the police could secure the area, trampling evidence into the mud. Lighting was poor, photography was limited, and witnesses gave conflicting accounts. The Ripper, whether by cunning or by chance, left nothing behind. Still, Scotland Yard pursued leads. One theory suggested the killer was a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, given the precision of the abdominal mutilations. Detectives visited every meat shop in Whitechapel, questioning workers about their habits, knives, and movements. Another theory pointed toward medical knowledge. Doctors, surgeons, and medical students were scrutinized, their backgrounds checked for signs of madness or cruelty. Yet none could be linked directly to the crimes. The police also wrestled with the flood of letters. Thousands of them, many claiming to be from the killer, others offering wild theories. Sorting hoaxes from possible clues consumed valuable time, while some detectives dismissed the infamous "Dear Boss" and "From Hell" letters as pranks. The public demanded they be treated as genuine threats. Scotland Yard could not ignore them, even as the true killer slipped further into shadow. Witness statements, too, proved slippery. Several women reported seeing suspicious men lingering near the victims before their deaths. Descriptions varied. One witness swore the man had a dark mustache. Another claimed he was clean-shaven. Yet another insisted he was foreign, with a heavy accent. These contradictions left the police with little more than confusion. Still, composite sketches were drawn, circulated, and distributed among patrol officers, though none brought them closer to the killer. Inspector Aberline and his team were under immense pressure. Newspapers mocked their failures daily. Politicians demanded resignations. Even the public began to take matters into their own hands, forming neighborhood watch groups and vigilante patrols. Angry mobs sometimes attacked men they suspected of being the Ripper, fueled by rumor rather than evidence. The police found themselves not only chasing a murderer, but also managing the fury of a city spiraling toward chaos. One of the most haunting aspects of the investigation was its endless suspects. At one time or another, hundreds of men were questioned, followed, or even arrested. Some were local laborers, others were foreigners, and still others were men of surprising respectability. Each seemed promising at first, yet each was eventually released for lack of evidence. The frustration mounted. The public cried out for justice, but the detectives could not deliver. Aberline himself became a symbol of the struggle. Tireless, methodical, and dedicated, he poured himself into the case. Yet even he admitted, years later, that he never felt certain of the killer's identity. He followed leads across Whitechapel, from dark alleys to dingy pubs, but the truth always slipped through his fingers like smoke. The pressure reached a breaking point in November 1888, after the horrific murder of Mary Jane Kelly. The brutality of that crime, the worst of them all, left even hardened officers shaken. Scotland Yard doubled its efforts, increasing patrols, offering rewards, and interrogating anyone even remotely suspicious. But after Kelly's death, the killings abruptly stopped. The Ripper seemed to vanish. Some believed he had been arrested for another crime, institutionalized in an asylum, or fled the country. Others whispered that he had died taking his secrets to the grave. For the detectives, this was both a relief and a torment. The murders had ended, but without a capture, without a confession, there was no closure. Scotland Yard could not claim victory. The killer remained nameless, faceless, free. In the years that followed, many of the officers involved looked back with bitterness. They had done everything they could with the tools of their time, yet history judged them as failures. The name Jack the Ripper became not only a symbol of terror, but also a reminder of the limits of Victorian policing. For Inspector Aberline, the case haunted him for the rest of his life. He continued his work, eventually retiring with honor. But he never shook the memory of those foggy nights in Whitechapel, when he chased a ghost through the streets and never caught him. The struggle of Scotland Yard against Jack the Ripper was more than a police investigation. It was a battle between order and chaos, law and mystery. And in the end, the mystery won. In the wake of the Whitechapel murders, suspicion spread like wildfire. The police had interviewed hundreds of men, but none were ever charged. Yet as the years passed, names began to emerge. Men who fit the profile, who lived near the crime scenes, who had strange habits, violent tendencies, or shadowy pasts. Each new theory promised revelation, yet none ever provided certainty. The identity of Jack the Ripper remained a riddle, and the suspects became part of the legend. One of the earliest and most enduring suspects was Montague John Druitt, a young barrister and schoolteacher. Druitt came from a respectable family, but in late 1888, shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, he was dismissed from his teaching post under mysterious circumstances. Weeks later, his body was pulled from the River Thames, an apparent suicide. Some police officials believed the timing was too perfect to ignore. Perhaps the murders had ended because Druitt was dead. He was said to have suffered from bouts of mental instability, and his death lent weight to the theory. Yet no evidence ever tied him directly to the crimes, leaving his guilt a matter of speculation. Another prominent suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He was a hairdresser by trade, but suffered from severe mental illness. By 1891, he was committed to an asylum where he spent the rest of his life. Police records from the time note that some officers strongly suspected him of being the Ripper, citing his hatred of women and disturbed behavior. In recent years, DNA testing on a shawl claimed to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes pointed to Kosminski's lineage. But the evidence remains controversial, tainted by questions of contamination and flawed methodology. Still, to many, he is one of the most likely culprits. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief. His criminal record was extensive, filled with frauds and petty crimes. Scotland Yard named him a possible suspect, largely because of his violent temper and suspicious movements around the time of the murders. But closer examination revealed little to connect him with the killings. Most historians now believe his inclusion was more about xenophobia and fear of foreigners than real evidence. George Chapman, also known as Severin Klosowski, stands out as another chilling figure. A Polish-born barber surgeon, Chapman moved to London and later became infamous for poisoning 3 of his wives with antimony. He was hanged in 1903 for his crimes. Inspector Aberline himself suspected Chapman of being Jack the Ripper, pointing to his medical background, violent nature, and cold-blooded cruelty. But critics argue that poisoning and knife mutilation are vastly different methods of murder, making it unlikely he was the Ripper. One of the most intriguing and controversial suspects was Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who traveled extensively between Britain and the United States. Tumblety was flamboyant, eccentric, and known for his hatred of women. During the autumn of 1888, he was in London and arrested on unrelated charges. Soon after, he fled back to America. Some believe his sudden departure was suspicious and his misogyny made him a prime candidate. But again, there was no hard evidence. Then there is the theory of the royal connection. The claim that Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, was the killer, or that the murders were part of a conspiracy to cover up his alleged affair with a working-class woman. This theory gained popularity in the late 20th century, spurred by books and films, but historians have largely dismissed it. The prince was not even in London during some of the murders, and the conspiracy narrative, though sensational, collapses under scrutiny. Another widely discussed figure was James Maybrick, a wealthy Liverpool cotton merchant. In the 1990s, a diary surfaced, supposedly written by Maybrick, confessing to the Ripper murders. It described the killings in lurid detail and signed off with the initials JTR. For a time, the diary caused a sensation, convincing many that the mystery was solved. But investigations revealed inconsistencies, and most experts now regard the diary as a modern forgery. Still, it fueled endless debate, keeping Maybrick's name in the conversation. There were countless other suspects: local butchers, lunatics, sailors, and even artists like Walter Sickert, whom crime novelist Patricia Cornwell once accused. Sickert's dark paintings and eccentric personality seemed to match the psychological profile, but the evidence was circumstantial at best. Each suspect reflected the fears and biases of the time: foreigners, immigrants, the mentally ill, the poor, even the powerful elite. Jack the Ripper became a mirror into which society projected its anxieties. What makes the suspect list so fascinating is not just the number of names, but the diversity of them. Some were petty criminals, others respected professionals. Some were madmen, others coldly rational. Each theory reveals more about the storyteller than about the killer himself. Scotland Yard may have narrowed its private suspicions, but publicly, the truth remained out of reach. And perhaps that is the essence of the Ripper mystery. With every new suspect comes the thrill of possibility, the hope that the puzzle might finally be solved. Yet with every revelation comes disappointment, as the evidence crumbles under scrutiny. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains hidden not only in history but in myth, a shadow that no spotlight can banish. In the end, the suspects are less about finding the man than about understanding the fear. Each name tells us something about Victorian London, its class divides, its distrust of foreigners, its fear of madness, and its obsession with respectability. Jack the Ripper was never caught, but in the parade of suspects, we glimpse the society that created him. The truth may be forever out of reach, but the mystery lives on. For every man accused, for every theory proposed, one fact remains unshakable. Someone, somewhere, walked those streets in 1888, knife in hand, and vanished into legend. The murders of 1888 were more than a string of crimes in a poor district of London. They became a turning point, a dark mirror held up to Victorian society, reflecting its fears, failures, and fascinations. Long after the killing stopped, the shadow of Jack the Ripper lingered, shaping how the world thought about crime, law, and evil itself. His legacy was written not only in blood, but in the very way we understand violence today. For the people of Whitechapel, the fear never truly faded. The women who survived the Autumn of Terror carried scars that ran deeper than the fog-filled alleys they walked. Each step down a dark street, each whispered rumor of a suspicious man reminded them of the monster who had stalked their sisters. Lodging houses still echoed with stories of the Ripper, passed from one tenant to another, each version more chilling than the last. Even when the murders ceased, Whitechapel never fully recovered from the stain of infamy. The district became synonymous with danger, its poverty forever linked with the nightmare of 1888. For the police, the case was a humiliation. Scotland Yard, once proud of its reputation for modern policing, was mocked and mistrusted. The Ripper had exposed the limits of Victorian law enforcement. Detectives had no fingerprints to analyze, no blood tests to rely on, no reliable system for preserving crime scenes. They were forced to rely on witness statements and gut instinct, tools that proved hopeless against a cunning predator. The failure to catch him haunted the yard for decades, pushing future generations of officers to demand better techniques. In a way, Jack the Ripper became the unintentional father of forensic science, for his crimes highlighted the desperate need for new methods. In the public imagination, the Ripper became something larger than life. He was no longer just a man, but a symbol of the unknown. The faceless killer who could be anyone, anywhere. He was the embodiment of the terror that lurked in dark alleys, the proof that even the heart of an empire was not safe from evil. For Victorians, who prided themselves on progress, order, and civilization, the Ripper was a shocking reminder that barbarity still thrived at the core of their world. The murders also shone a spotlight on the brutal inequalities of London. Middle-class readers, safe in their drawing rooms, were horrified to learn of the conditions in Whitechapel, of the overcrowded tenements, the hunger, the desperation that drove women into prostitution. For a moment, the suffering of the poor was impossible to ignore. Reformers used the murders to argue for better housing, safer streets, and more humane treatment of the underclass. Yet others exploited the crimes to stoke fear of immigrants, feeding the fires of prejudice. In this way, Jack the Ripper became a political weapon, his shadow cast over debates about poverty, morality, and the very structure of society. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies in culture. Jack the Ripper was the first killer to become a global celebrity. His name appeared in newspapers across continents. Plays, pamphlets, and later novels turned him into a dark anti-hero, a figure both feared and fascinated. He was the first criminal of the mass media age. His story shaped as much by headlines as by reality. And once the legend took root, it never let go. In the decades that followed, the Ripper inspired countless works of fiction and art. He haunted the pages of detective stories, fueled the rise of true crime literature, and later the silver screen. Each generation reimagined him, sometimes as a mad doctor, sometimes as an aristocrat, sometimes as a faceless shadow. He became less a man and more a myth, an eternal villain lurking at the edge of imagination. The very idea of the serial killer, as we understand it today, owes much to Jack the Ripper. Before him, murderers were seen as criminals of passion, driven by greed, jealousy, or revenge. But the Ripper revealed something new, a predator who killed not for gain but for compulsion, who stalked victims methodically, who struck again and again. He was the prototype for the monsters that would follow in the centuries to come, from the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run in Cleveland to Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and beyond. Each new case echoed the terror first unleashed in Whitechapel. The legacy also endures in the language of fear. Even today, when people speak of a brutal, unknown killer, the name Ripper often resurfaces. Copycat killers have styled themselves after him. Journalists label modern crimes with references to his shadow. In some ways, he never left. He continues to stalk us, not in the flesh, but in the imagination. And yet, amidst the myth, the true tragedy can be forgotten. The women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were not just characters in a legend. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, human beings crushed by poverty and circumstance. Their lives were more than their deaths, but history has often reduced them to victims in the Ripper's tale. The legacy of fear should not eclipse the legacy of their humanity. Jack the Ripper's story is not merely about horror. It is about how horror changes us. It shows how society reacts to terror, how myths are born, how fear becomes culture. The foggy streets of Whitechapel may be long gone, but the shadows remain, carried in every story, every theory, every retelling. His identity may be lost, but his legacy is everywhere. In the end, perhaps that is why Jack the Ripper endures, not because of who he was, but because of what he represents. The unknown, the unstoppable, the darkness that no progress can fully banish. He is the whisper in the alley, the shadow on the corner, the proof that evil does not need a face to terrify the world. And so, more than a century later, the legacy of Jack the Ripper is not only written in history books. It lives in fear itself. More than a century has passed since the autumn of 1888, and yet Jack the Ripper's name remains etched into history. His story has outlived his time, his city, and even the memories of those who walked the foggy streets of Whitechapel. The murders ended, but the mystery never did. And perhaps that is why he continues to haunt us, because he was never caught, never unmasked, never reduced from a shadow to a man. Why was Jack the Ripper never identified? Some argue it was the limitations of Victorian policing. The detectives of Scotland Yard did what they could, but they lacked the tools of modern forensics. No fingerprints, no DNA, no crime, scene protocols. Every clue they might have had was trampled under the boots of curious onlookers or lost in the grime of the streets. The killer vanished into the fog simply because the age was not ready to catch him. Others point to the setting itself. Whitechapel was a maze of alleys, courts, and lodging houses filled with thousands of transient souls. Poverty gave anonymity. A man could melt into the crowd, unnoticed and unremembered. The women who worked the streets were vulnerable, living lives that made them easy prey, and tragically often overlooked by society. The Ripper thrived in an environment where invisibility was simple and suspicion was endless. And then there is the possibility that Jack the Ripper was never just one man. Some theorists suggest there may have been multiple killers, their crimes later bundled into one legend. Others argue that the Canonical 5 victims were linked, but later murders attributed to him were the work of copycats. The lack of certainty allows room for speculation, and speculation is the soil in which legends grow. Over the years, the list of suspects has grown long. Druitt, Kosminski, Chapman, Tumblety, Maybrick, and countless more. Each theory seems convincing at first glance, yet each collapses under closer inspection. Historians pore over diaries, analyze old police notes, and even use modern DNA testing on century-old artifacts, but still the answer eludes us. Each new claim of solving the case is met with excitement, only to fade into doubt. The Ripper's identity remains just out of reach, a puzzle with missing pieces, and perhaps that is why his legend endures. If Jack the Ripper had been caught, tried, and hanged, he would be remembered as just another killer, his name listed alongside the criminals of his age. But his anonymity gave him immortality. He became not only a man but a myth, a question that can never truly be answered. His story has been told in books, plays, films, and endless retellings, each time reshaped by the fears and fascinations of the age. He is at once a historical figure and a symbol of the unknown. But while we ponder his identity, we must not forget his victims. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were real women, living hard lives in a city that offered them little mercy. Their names deserve to be remembered not just as characters in a legend, but as human beings whose deaths forced the world to confront the brutal realities of poverty, inequality, and violence against women. Their tragedy is the heart of the story, even if the killer's shadow often steals the spotlight. Jack the Ripper's mystery is more than a fascination with murder. It is a reflection of ourselves. He embodies the fear of the dark, the terror of the unknown, the unsettling thought that evil can walk among us unseen. His story shows how myths are born, how panic spreads, how society responds when faced with something it cannot control. In him, we see the limits of progress, the fragility of order, and the truth that some questions may never be answered. And so the Ripper endures, not because of who he was, but because of what he represents. He is the mystery that refuses to die, the whisper in the alley, the knife in the fog. He belongs to history, but also to legend. And in that legend, he lives on, a phantom forever stalking the streets of Whitechapel. The murders stopped, the city moved forward, the world changed. But the question remains echoing across time: who was Jack the Ripper? The truth may be lost forever, but the mystery, like the shadow of the killer himself, will never fade.